Hello everyone, and welcome back to Terrifying Bedtime Tales. I know many of them use these videos to fall asleep. Before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Thomas had never meant to leave the familiar roads behind. It was supposed to be a short drive, a brief escape from the monotony of everyday life. But as the rain fell harder and the storm grew fiercer, the path twisted in ways that made no sense. The mountains appeared in the distance, enormous and otherworldly, shrouded in mist as if calling to him. When he finally pulled over to gather his bearings, strange figures appeared in the darkness, and a voice crackled through the static of his radio, calling his name. Then the road disappeared. Now, trapped in a place beyond understanding, Thomas must confront a truth darker than any nightmare. The creatures, the storm, the impossible landscape, it was all leading him somewhere. But where? And, more terrifyingly, who had led him here? In the face of creeping madness, all Thomas wants is to return home. But what if he never left it in the first place? The wind howled through the night, crashing against the windows with a force that seemed unnatural. Thomas sat behind the wheel, staring out at the darkened road that stretched endlessly before him. It had started as an ordinary evening, an after-work drive, a break from the monotony of his small suburban life. But now, things had taken a strange and unsettling turn. He could barely remember how he had gotten here. 1 minute, he had been driving through familiar streets, the hum of his car's engine a comforting background to his thoughts. The next, he had somehow found himself on an unfamiliar path, the road winding and twisting in ways that seemed foreign and unreal. A strange unease had settled in his stomach, but he couldn't quite put his finger on why. The dashboard clock read 9:42 p.m. The rain beat against the windshield, drumming relentlessly, as though it were trying to drown out any remaining sense of calm. The headlights cut through the sheets of rain, but they seemed to illuminate only more shadows. The road was deserted, no cars, no signs of life. Just the endless stretch of asphalt and the dark, overhanging trees on either side. Thomas knew there were mountains in the distance. He'd seen them earlier as he had driven, but the storm had obscured them, hiding them from view. Then, as if the world had shifted on its axis, the clouds parted for a brief moment, revealing the looming peaks of the mountains. They were massive, towering monoliths that seemed to stretch impossibly high into the stormy skies. Something about them felt wrong. Their jagged edges pierced through the clouds, and the snow-capped tips glowed faintly under the gray light. They didn't look like any mountains Thomas had seen before. The wind picked up again, rattling the car and tugging at the trees with a sound that sent a chill down his spine. He pulled the car over to the side of the road, unsure of what he was doing. His hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. It was at that moment that he saw them, shapes, figures moving in the distance, on the edge of his headlights' range. At first, they appeared to be shadows, strange and fleeting, but as the wind howled louder, the shapes grew clearer. They were creatures. They moved in jerky, unnatural motions, their long limbs twisting and bending in ways that seemed impossible. Thomas's heart raced in his chest, his breath catching in his throat. What were they? They didn't look human, but they were too solid to be mere illusions. He squinted into the dark, trying to make sense of the figures, but they seemed to move faster now, almost as if they were aware of his gaze. And then, one of them turned toward the car. It was humanoid, but not. The creature had long, sinewy limbs, and its skin was pale, almost translucent. Its eyes glowed a faint, eerie blue, and its mouth was wide, with sharp teeth visible even in the dim light. It stood tall, impossibly tall, and for a moment it seemed to stare directly at him, as though it could see inside his very soul. Thomas's heart hammered in his chest. His instinct told him to run, to drive away as fast as possible, but his body felt paralyzed, rooted to the spot. He couldn't move, couldn't look away. Then, without warning, the creature was gone. It vanished into the rain, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. The storm raged on, but now Thomas could barely hear it. The silence that followed was suffocating. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. Was it a hallucination? A trick of the light? No, it had been real. He was certain of it. But where was he? And why had he ended up here? He had no answers, no explanation. His only choice was to keep moving forward, even though the fear gnawing at him made it difficult to breathe. He started the car again, the engine sputtering before roaring back to life. With shaking hands, he gripped the wheel and drove forward, deeper into the unknown. The road curved sharply ahead, and as he rounded the bend, something even more bizarre greeted him. A massive stone archway stood at the center of the road. It was ancient, weathered by time, with intricate carvings along its surface. There were no signs, no markings to indicate what it was or where it led. It was as if it had always been there, waiting for him. The archway seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, its presence impossible to ignore. Thomas slowed the car, his eyes locked on the structure. Should he turn back? Was this a sign? Or was it too late to change course now? With a deep breath, he pressed the accelerator, driving under the archway and into the darkness beyond. As he passed through, the temperature seemed to drop dramatically, the air thickening with an almost tangible pressure. The world outside had changed entirely. The familiar landscape had vanished, replaced by a twisted, alien world. The trees, once tall and slender, were now gnarled and deformed, their bark twisted into grotesque shapes. The sky overhead was no longer a soft gray. It was a swirling mass of black clouds, punctuated by flashes of eerie, green lightning. The wind howled louder now, and the rain fell in torrents, but it felt different, thicker, heavier, as though the elements themselves were conspiring against him. Thomas could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he drove deeper into the strange landscape. His mind was reeling, each thought more disjointed than the last. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, as if leading nowhere and everywhere at once. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creatures from before, but there was nothing, only the rain and the swirling darkness. He took a sharp turn, his tires screeching on the wet road. And then, just ahead, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. A massive figure stood in the middle of the road. It was unlike anything Thomas had ever seen, a towering, humanoid shape that seemed to be made entirely of stone, its body covered in ancient runes that glowed with an eerie, faint blue light. It didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. The creature's eyes, if it had eyes, seemed to pierce through the very fabric of reality itself. Thomas slammed on the brakes, his car screeching to a halt just inches from the creature. His hands shook violently as he tried to process what he was seeing. What was this thing? What did it want? The creature remained motionless, its stone-like body silent and unmoving. For what felt like an eternity, Thomas stared at it, the air thick with tension. The wind howled louder, the rain beating against the car, but the creature, whatever it was, remained still. Then, slowly, it began to move. It took a single step forward, and the ground trembled beneath it. The stones of the road cracked, splintering under its immense weight. Thomas's breath hitched in his throat. He had to go. He had to get out of here. But his body didn't respond. He was frozen in place, unable to tear his eyes away from the looming figure. The creature's hand, the size of a small boulder, reached down toward the car, its fingers stretching out with a strange, unnatural fluidity. A deep, guttural sound reverberated through the air, and then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. Just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature vanished into the mist. The road ahead was empty. The silence returned, but now it felt suffocating. Thomas exhaled shakily, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what was real anymore. Was he dreaming? Had he driven too far? Or had he stumbled into something far darker? Something he couldn't comprehend? He didn't know. All he knew was that he had to keep moving. There was no turning back now. With trembling hands, he shifted the car into gear and drove forward once again, the world around him shifting and twisting with every passing moment. Whatever he had stumbled upon, whatever this place was, he had no way of knowing. But one thing was certain: he was no longer in control, and there was no telling where the road would lead next. The car hummed softly under his hands as Thomas pressed the accelerator, his grip tightening with every passing second. The eerie silence that followed the disappearance of the massive stone creature was both a relief and a curse. The wind howled like a living thing, the storm seemingly growing fiercer with every mile. But no matter how fast he drove, no matter how far he pressed the pedal, it felt as though the world was closing in around him. The rain battered the windshield, the wipers struggling to keep up with the downpour. The road ahead twisted sharply, winding its way through a dense forest that seemed to grow darker with each passing moment. The trees, now even more twisted and unnerving than before, pressed close to the road, their branches clawing at the car like skeletal hands trying to drag him into the unknown. Thomas glanced nervously at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the massive stone figure behind him. But there was nothing. He thought about the creature's eyes, glowing faintly blue, and the way it had moved with unnatural precision. The sheer force of its presence still weighed heavily on him, making his breath shallow and ragged. He tried to shake off the thoughts, but they clung to him like shadows, refusing to leave. The radio crackled to life suddenly, the static hissing as the faint sound of a voice emerged from the blackness of the storm. It was barely audible at first, but it was unmistakably human. "Thomas, Thomas, can you hear me?" The voice sounded distorted, as though it was coming from somewhere far away, and yet it also felt immediate, as though it was right there in the car with him. His eyes widened. Who's there? But the voice didn't answer. Instead, a sharp burst of static filled the air, and the radio cut out entirely. He was left with the deafening sound of the wind, the rain, and the ever-present pressure in the air that made it feel like something was watching him, something waiting. His hands clenched the wheel tighter, his mind racing. This couldn't be real. The storm, the strange creatures, the voice, it all felt like a nightmare. But no matter how hard he tried to rationalize it, he couldn't explain what was happening. He couldn't understand how he had ended up here. As if the universe itself had heard his thoughts, the car's headlights flickered once, twice, and then died. The sudden darkness was overwhelming. His heart slammed against his chest, the sudden loss of visibility sending a jolt of panic through him. Panic was all he had left. He slammed his hands against the dashboard, his breath coming in short gasps. "Come on," he muttered to himself, slamming the ignition once more. The engine sputtered to life, but the headlights remained off, leaving him driving through pitch-black darkness. But then something caught his eye. A faint light, just ahead, glowing in the distance like a tiny star. It was the only source of illumination in an otherwise inky world. It beckoned him, pulling him toward it, as though it were a lifeline in a sea of blackness. Without thinking, Thomas turned the wheel sharply, the tires skidding slightly on the wet road. His pulse quickened as he drove toward the light, not knowing what to expect, but unable to resist its pull. As he got closer, the light grew larger, revealing itself to be the flickering glow of torches set up along a narrow path. The path appeared to be carved into the side of a cliff, winding upward toward what seemed to be a massive stone gate. It was an ancient structure, tall and imposing, its surface covered in runic symbols that seemed to shimmer in the torchlight. Thomas stopped the car just short of the gate, his eyes wide as he took in the sight before him. This wasn't a normal road. This wasn't a place he recognized. He hesitated, staring at the imposing structure. Should he go through it? Or was this just another illusion? But the question didn't have time to form in his mind before the gate creaked open slowly, as though inviting him in. There was no sound, no mechanism, just the gate swinging outward on its own. The air around him grew colder, the wind picking up again, as though something was breathing down his neck. It was a warning. He could feel it deep in his bones, but the pull toward the gate was irresistible. He took a deep breath, shifted the car into gear, and drove through the stone arch. As soon as the car passed under the gate, the temperature dropped drastically. His breath became visible, the chill seeping into his very skin. The road ahead was no longer a paved highway, but a narrow, winding path that seemed to rise up the side of the cliff, the torches lighting the way. The trees on either side were no longer trees at all, but twisted, blackened stumps with limbs that reached toward the sky, like fingers grasping for the stars. Something was wrong. Everything felt wrong. The path continued to climb, and Thomas could feel the pressure in the air growing stronger, heavier. His head throbbed with each passing moment, as though the very weight of the world was pressing down on him. He reached the top of the path and was greeted by a clearing that stretched out before him. At the center of the clearing stood an enormous black stone structure, a towering temple-like building that seemed to pulse with an ominous energy. It was surrounded by strange figures, cloaked in dark robes that covered their faces. They stood in silence, watching him as he drove toward them. Thomas felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He wanted to turn around. He wanted to leave, but it was as if the air itself held him in place, forcing him to continue. He stopped the car at the edge of the clearing, unsure of what to do next. The cloaked figures didn't move. They didn't speak. They simply stood there, their presence oppressive and suffocating. And then one of them stepped forward. It was a woman, or at least it appeared to be. Her face was hidden beneath the folds of her dark cloak, but her hands were pale and slender, gloved in black leather. She extended a hand toward him, and for a moment, Thomas couldn't move. Something in her presence called to him, an unspoken command that urged him to step out of the car. He didn't want to go. He didn't want to follow whatever this was. But despite his fear, his body moved on its own accord. He opened the door and stepped out into the clearing. The wind howled, and the rain began to fall again in sheets. But the woman remained still, her outstretched hand unwavering. "Come," she said in a voice that was both soft and commanding. Her voice sent a chill down his spine, but he couldn't stop himself from moving toward her. "What do you want from me?" His voice trembled, barely a whisper, as though speaking louder might make everything even more real. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that made him feel as though she was peering into the depths of his very soul. "You are lost," she said finally, "but you are not alone." Before he could respond, she gestured toward the temple behind her. The dark figures standing in the clearing seemed to shift, their cloaks billowing in the wind. The air grew heavier still, pressing in from all sides. Thomas stepped back, panic rising in his chest. He had to get away. This wasn't real. He had to escape, but it was too late. As he turned toward the car, the world around him seemed to distort. The trees, the path, the sky, they all began to melt into one, swirling together like a storm of darkness. And with a final bone-chilling gust of wind, The road behind him disappeared entirely. There was no turning back, no escape. In the distance, the temple's dark silhouette loomed, waiting for him to take the next step. The storm raged in full fury now, the wind howling like a living creature, its voice carrying an otherworldly shriek. Thomas stood frozen in the clearing, his heart racing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The figures in the darkness moved toward him slowly, their footsteps muffled by the thick rain. The woman with the pale, gloved hand had stepped back, but her eyes never left him, cold, piercing, as though she could see every secret he had ever kept. For a moment, time itself seemed to slow, and Thomas felt like he was caught in a dream he couldn't wake up from. His legs felt like lead, his thoughts jumbled and tangled. His heart screamed at him to run, to escape this nightmarish place, but his body wouldn't obey. The figures had surrounded him now, their cloaks swirling in the wind, faces still hidden in shadow. The dark temple loomed behind them, its entrance a yawning black maw that seemed to pulse with an eerie, unnatural energy. It was like staring into the void, deep, endless, and hungry. The woman spoke again, her voice low but clear, cutting through the storm. "You've come far, Thomas," she said, "farther than most. But you've lost your way. You cannot return now." Thomas swallowed, his throat dry, his eyes darting from one cloaked figure to the next. Each of them seemed to watch him with an unsettling stillness, like predators waiting for the right moment to strike. I don't know where I am," Thomas stammered. "Please, I just want to go home." Her lips barely moved as she responded, but the words hit him like a cold slap. "Home is a lie, a place you left long ago. You are here now, with us, in this place beyond your world. You were always meant to be here." Her words hung in the air, thick with an ominous weight. Thomas felt his stomach churn, nausea creeping up his throat as the reality of her words settled over him. His mind raced. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. He was just lost. This was some twisted dream or hallucination. He stepped back instinctively, his heart pounding in his chest. But before he could turn to run, one of the cloaked figures stepped forward, its hand reaching out from under its hood. Its fingers were long, too long, the skin unnaturally pale, as if it had never seen sunlight. Thomas flinched, but the figure's hand didn't touch him. Instead, it hovered just above his shoulder. The air around them crackled with a strange energy, and in that instant, Thomas felt something shift inside him. It was like a door opening in the depths of his mind, something old, something ancient, that had been buried deep within him for a long time. He saw flashes of images, dark forests, twisted roads, a glowing figure. And then the mountains. The mountains. They were always there, looming in the distance, a reminder of something forgotten, something he had once known but had lost over the years. The woman's voice broke through his thoughts, sharper now, as though she were speaking directly into his soul. "Remember, Thomas, you were meant for this. The road you walked led you here. The creatures you saw, the shadows, the storm, everything was a part of the path you chose." The words echoed in his mind, and with them came the sensation of an overwhelming presence, the feeling that he was being watched, not by the cloaked figures around him, but by something far more ancient, something far older than anything he could comprehend. "You were never lost," she continued. "You were always here." And then, without warning, the figures moved in unison, their cloaks billowing around them like shadows come to life. Their hands reached out toward him, and in that moment, Thomas understood. There was no escape. The road he had driven, the storm, the mountains, they were all part of this place, this reality that stretched beyond the limits of his understanding. It was no longer a world he could leave. His heart pounded in his chest as the ground beneath him trembled. The black stone temple behind him seemed to rise higher, its walls now glowing faintly, pulsing with an eerie light. The air around him grew thicker, oppressive. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. His mind was clouded with the realization that everything, the storm, the figures, the creatures, had led him here. To this moment, to this place. The woman stepped closer, her face still hidden beneath her hood, but her presence overwhelming. There was a strange, almost sympathetic aura to her now, as though she pitied him. "You don't understand yet," she whispered, "but you will." With that, she extended her hand toward him, her fingers brushing his forehead. The coldness of her touch burned through him, spreading like ice across his skin. He gasped, the sensation coursing through his body, and in that instant, everything went dark. No sound, no light, no rain. For a moment, Thomas floated in an endless void, his body weightless, his mind blank. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, a blinding light exploded before him, filling his vision with a brightness so intense it hurt. When the light faded, he was no longer standing in the clearing. He was inside the temple. The walls were smooth black stone, etched with glowing runes. The air inside was thick, heavy with the weight of ancient knowledge. The ground beneath him pulsed with energy, as though the temple itself were alive. But it was the sight before him that took his breath away. In the center of the room stood a massive stone altar, and on it lay a figure encased in what looked like a glass coffin. The figure was still, motionless, but there was something hauntingly familiar about it. Thomas's heart clenched as he stepped closer. The figure in the coffin was him. He staggered back, his breath catching in his throat. How could this be? How could he be there? The coffin was a perfect replica of him, but it wasn't him. Not in the way he understood himself to be. There was a faint, pulsing light inside the glass, and as Thomas stared at it, he realized the truth. He had never left this place. He had never been lost at all. This was the place he had been born for, the place he had been waiting to return to. He was home. The woman's voice echoed in his mind, gentle yet firm. "This is your final step, Thomas. The road you walked was always leading you here. You belong to us now." Thomas felt the weight of the truth settle over him, and for the first time, the fear that had consumed him faded into something else. A strange peace, as though everything was exactly as it should be. And then, the light from the coffin flared brighter. He stepped forward, his hands trembling, and the world around him shifted once more. The temple faded into nothingness, and Thomas finally truly disappeared.